Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody listening wherever and whenever this podcast finds you. Thank you for tuning in and welcome to the Did You Know podcast. Today we're going to be talking to Nic Carter, and it was a very interesting conversation. We kind of freestyled a bit about a bunch of different topics, mainly about his latest Medium post called A Most Peaceful Revolution, and a lot of different topics around Bitcoin and just kind of these unique traits to Bitcoin that you don't find in other altcoins, and quite a few other topics as well. I think you guys are going to really enjoy this. So first thing I would ask is if you could go to iTunes and leave a 5-star and a written review. That would help immensely. If you also want to save on a bunch of different Bitcoin related products, go to supportmypodcast.com. There you'll find ways to support the podcast, but also if you click on listener supported discount button right as you come to the website, you'll get access to the website and get savings on things like Tracer, Keep Keys, and a bunch of other different things. So I'm going to be adding new stuff as it comes. I would ask that you sign up for the email list, and that's how you get access to that. So it's absolutely free. I don't sell any of your information, and I just send out emails only occasionally, just to kind of let you know what's going on with the podcast and when new discounts come. And also, I wanted to talk to you a little bit real quick about eToro. They are a trusted smart trading platform that's over 12 years old. They conduct about $1 trillion in trading annually. That's a lot. They offer some really cool, innovative tools, advanced charting features, and it helps you to be the best trader that you can be. U.S. customers can now trade the most popular crypto assets with transparent low fees. And if you're new to trading, while you're learning, it's a really cool thing because you can actually practice strategies with their virtual trading tool. They give you basically 100,000 fake virtual dollars that you can practice various strategies with, and you can see how they'd actually react in a real trading environment. So before you actually test out different theories and trading strategies, you can test them out there. So head over to didyouknowcrypto.com /eToro. That's eToro. It'll help you you'll go to their website. You can sign up. It'll help them know that you came from me. But also, once you sign up through that link, you get $50 for free. Subject to some terms and conditions. You have a minimum deposit that you have to put in there. So head over to didyouknowcrypto.com /eToro. That's eToro. And lastly, I'd like to thank you, the listeners. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I see the numbers have been rising over the month, and I really appreciate you guys taking time out of your day to listen to me. So please reach out on social media. Go to didyouknowcrypto.com, and you can find all of my social media links. Reach out. Feel free to ask me questions. Just contact me. My DMs are open. All that kind of good stuff. So enjoy the show. I'd like to welcome Nic Carter, co-founder of Castle Island Ventures and CoinMetrics.io. He previously worked at Fidelity as their first Bitcoin and crypto asset analyst. He's also a prolific writer and speaker. Nic, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, man.
Yeah, I loved your most recent article that was entitled A Most Peaceful Revolution. But before that, I wanted to ask you a question that I think is kind of unfairly tagged as being cliche, because I think it is actually the most important question that we have in Bitcoin, and that is, what is Bitcoin?
Dude, I wish people would ask me that more, man. I was prepping for Pomp's podcast, and I was certain he was going to ask me that, and I was super disappointed when he didn't. And so I've been waiting for someone to ask me what Bitcoin is.
Yeah, I think too many people kind of feel like, well, they get asked that, and now it's seen as cliche, but it's very interesting to see people from different walks of life how they view Bitcoin, and also I think it's very it's a good way to understand a person in this space on how they view it, because it does vary from person to person, and just depending on their life experience and where they're at in this journey right now.
So I am often disappointed by people that will give some like cliched like 2 word answer um, to that question, because it's actually the most important question in the whole industry, because it's like, like like I'm just thinking back to my like metaphysics 101 courses in school, and the question was like, were numbers, were they invented or were they discovered? Was mathematics invented or discovered? And I think the you could actually kind of make the case or ask that same question of Bitcoin. Like, to me, it seems almost like an alien system that we're just still discovering the ramifications of, and we're trying to wrap our heads around it still. So I call it the ontology of Bitcoin. I've been trying to work on an article about it for over a year now, which I haven't finished. But I do think it's the most interesting question that actually exists in the whole industry right now. So
Yeah, it. Oh, yeah.
yeah,
Sorry.
maybe I'll. So I have sort of well developed thoughts on it, so I can give you an answer.
Yeah, no, take as much time as you need, because I think that I also think that the just I understand when you're talking to kind of a depends on your audience, right? So if you're on a show where they don't know anything about Bitcoin, it's easier to just kind of give a very generic answer of it just being a ledger or something like a decentralized ledger of blah 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 blah, right? But I really interested to hear kind of a your kind of in-depth take on it.
So let me see. I formulated an answer in my head a couple weeks ago. I was trying to be um, as specific as possible, but also without too much complexity. So my take on what Bitcoin is, um, I think it's two things in one. So the first thing is a um, a means for conveying value through a communications medium. And then the other thing that it is as well is a new form of property registry, um, which is not dependent on um, the state or force for those property rights to be enforced. And in particular, Bitcoin is the unbroken registry initiated by Satoshi in 2009. But it's easy to imagine an alternative world where Satoshi specified the protocol, the first part, and then never initiated the registry, you know, never started mining, you know. Um, and at that point, Bitcoin would have been only the first thing. And I think that's important because, on the one hand, it's quote unquote just value conveyance technology. It's just a software to move money around on the internet. But on the other hand, it's also, and the thing that's very special about it, in my opinion, is that it's a very fair system, which was initiated under the best possible circumstances, 10 years ago, and has persisted to this day. And so the system, the protocol, it should be disentangled from the kind of the frontier, like, new property registry, which has been established over the last decade, and like billions of value has been poured into it, and is considered very um, uh, to have a lot of credibility and to be secure. So I think, basically, long-winded way of saying, I think it's two things at once. And when people talk about what Bitcoin is, they do a really bad job of disentangling the two.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I struggle myself to try to explain it, because on the face of it, for people that are kind of outside and just coming in, you think that it would be something very simple to explain, just like what is Twitter. Well, it's a social media website where people can in a short amount of characters, convey their ideas and be able to interact with people and spread news fast and all that kind of stuff. Where with Bitcoin, it's a much more I don't it's a very deep, and I think we're still discovering what it means and the questions that its very existence kind of bring to the conversation about a much larger question, as far as for what is actually needed in society, as far as for what's needed to be centralized and what doesn't need to be centralized, or as a better way, I guess, is to that it takes away the excuse for the need for centralization for a lot of things, right? So we have to have X in place because that's the only way to be an arbiter, like you said, of property
Yeah,
rights. So the only ones that can do that. Have you listened to Max Hillebrand's kind of explanation on that, where he kind of
I'm actually
talks
not
about it
familiar with that.
Oh, okay. It was a very interesting concept that I've been thinking about more. I've been trying to get him on to talk to in more depth on it, but his was that Bitcoin itself is not really property, and that you just kind of occult the knowledge of the private key, and that as long as you are a good steward of that knowledge, it remains yours. But if you're a bad steward of it, right? Like the Ethereum, a while back, where the a bunch of people using the private key of one in Ethereum,
Yeah,
and they were getting their value stolen out of that. Where it was kind of an interesting concept. I don't necessarily 100% agree with it, in that I do think of Bitcoin as being like you have that property right, that is verified, but the concept of occulting the knowledge, in terms of the religious connotations of Bitcoin was interesting to me.
I can see it both ways. I think of Bitcoin literally as property in the most tangible and literal sense. I do like stuff like multisig and poor entropy in key generation definitely complicates that. But I imagine like ultimately the UTXO set is just a list of who owns what, right? Of like which keys can claim ownership over which UTXOs, right? So and then at the most abstract level, it's literally a list of what entities are able to claim ownership over the units of the system. So to me, like the best analogy for that is like a new frontier, like um, like a new continent was discovered, and we've just started to colonize it and build our homesteads on it and start like improving them. That's how I think about Bitcoin, the property system at least.
In your article, you that I mentioned earlier, a most peaceful revolution, you criticize altcoiners, less for anything that's specifically kind of tech or economic related, but kind of their lack of conviction and dedication and kind of this metagame that Bitcoin is fighting in. Do you mind explaining that kind of more in depth of the concept that you're getting at there?
Yeah, that's actually the most important takeaway from the article. That was the whole article um, emerged from a single sentence which sprang into my head as I was walking my Shih Tzu puppy, um, and the sentence was the one that begins with the great sin of altcoiners, yada yada. I don't exactly remember what I said, uh, but the point is that they thought they were playing one game, but they're playing a different game. So they didn't even realize what the rules of the game were. They thought they were playing checkers, but the game was chess, basically. So to them, to the vast majority of people that I know that experiment with altcoins, the justification is always like, look, we're just this is permissionless innovation. We're just tinkering around. You know, maybe we'll invent a better system for proof of work, proof of stake, a better algorithm. Maybe we'll invent some better cryptography, and it should logically follow that better tech yields a better system, and that so that there would be some deterministic outcome. If you create better tech, then you create a better money and you'd get more users, and then your thing would outcompete Bitcoin, you know? And like literally name any coin and I can tell you um, how their narrative goes that they would succeed Bitcoin as the number one, you know, virtual currency. Like name a coin and I'll tell you what their predominant narrative is.
We'll just go with Litecoin.
Yeah, so Litecoin, classic example. Initially, actually, people don't know this today, but Litecoin back in 2012 had they were committed to being ASIC resistant because the narrative back then was that ASICs introduced dangerous concentration, and so they had this script algorithm for proof of work, and the idea was that it would be more memory hard, and that ASICs wouldn't emerge, and so it would be much more fair, and it would win out. And then now it's more. I mean, it's amazing that there are people that still have faith in Litecoin, but after ASICs were inevitably created for script, the narrative was more that it's just slightly faster, and so it would be a better user experience, and it would win out for payments, with the idea that payments are the key function that leads to a cryptocurrency having success and credibility. Um, so, so the point is that virtually all altcoins are impregnated with this belief that superior technical features, you know, marginal technical innovations are what cause a a currency or virtual commodity to win out against all the others. And the point I'm making in the article is that that's not the case. That it could be the case that the winning cryptocurrency, which I think the one in absolute pole position here is Bitcoin, is vastly inferior along all the technical elements, and that most of the claimed enhancements come at the expense of some really critical features. And like not only that, but the people that are creating these alternative systems have no clue what the preconditions are for creating a valid and a credible monetary system. And they gave the important stuff no thought, and they gave the much less critical stuff a lot of thought. So they had it completely backwards. And so far, I haven't seen any developers or leadership of any alternative coins to Bitcoin giving sufficient thought to the important stuff. And I've been a little vague about what I think that is, but I think it's really the legitimacy endowing factors or the credibility endowing factors. And so that's really basic stuff like how are the coins distributed? And I think if you had a pre-sale or an ICO, you are surrendering your legitimacy on an a priori basis. Like you lost before the race even began. You know, like you're disqualified, basically, in my opinion. It's like you show up to the swim meet and you have like flippers on. It's just like you've immediately lost your credibility. And that because if your thing was to become money, and there's some individual that owns 20% of it because they created 20% at a cost of zero, that corrupts it permanently, I think, in the minds of all the potential kind of would-be adopters. And the really important thing about Bitcoin, that's why we always bang on about the Immaculate Conception, is that there is no way to create units more cheaply than the market price. Like you can mine to get those new Bitcoins, or you can buy them on the market. But miners are not able to mine at like a big discount to market price. They have to pay their way in hashes, which, and like mining is a competitive industry, so you can't really mine at a massive discount to market price. So that's one thing. The other stuff I would say would be the elimination of monetary discretion in the system. So very, very few alternative cryptocurrencies um, are hardened against basically lobbying or the imposition of special interests. So since these systems are big and they're worth billions of dollars and they move billions of dollars every day, it's important that they be resistant to any economic interests which might seek to corrupt or change the protocol in a way that benefits them, which we call lobbying, in conventional politics. And the way to do that really is to commit to having the system have an initial configuration, to enshrine certain values, like the way the Constitution enshrines certain values, and then stick to that. And then also the other way to do that is to have a good separation of powers, like you have in Bitcoin with the miners, developers, economic nodes, etc. And to make the system very difficult, resistant to change. And so I would say only Bitcoin enshrines that, the resistance to special interests, basically. And absolutely none of the competitors do. They can all be changed arbitrarily. That's because the developers themselves have an interest in changing the system arbitrarily because they've sold it to investors as being innovative, fast moving, move fast and break things, et cetera, et cetera. So their whole reason for existence is super paradoxical because they're claiming that they're going to be able to implement technical changes much faster when really what you want is the opposite. You want the system to be very predictable, to enshrine certain rules, to make certain values evident in the protocol specification, and then to not tamper with that too much, because the stakes are extremely high, in a money system. And if you change the rules on people, that could involve confiscating their hard-earned wealth, and then no one's going to trust the system. So I'll take a break now, but yeah, that's the main point in the article.
Yeah, no, and I think that kind of the line that you also had in there. Oh, and then I'll just read the thought. The great sin in your article, you wrote, the great sin of all coiners is not that they backed the wrong horse, but they did so with insufficient conviction. They sold a dream that they themselves did not believe. And you had a line in there as well as you kind of talking about the devotion, right? I think that altcoins, they don't have the devotion from the get-go that's needed to kind of create like an evangelical population that Bitcoin had from the get-go. And when the leadership, their incentive is that, like you wrote, is to saddle their converts basically with their own sins, I guess, if you want to look at this in a religious context. And it kind of creates an increasingly, and by their sins I mean these coins that are they have to dump them on new people, and then as they continue to lose value, and this creates an increasingly disillusioned following. And I think that you're correct that that dooms the project from the onset. Whereas I think that, I know not everybody has this belief, but I think that when you look at Bitcoin more as a religion in a way, and Giacomo Zucco had talked about this in I think it was a panel, I can't remember, a few months back. Whereas Bitcoin is kind of more of a religion, a movement, whereas a lot of these altcoins are just kind of more like a cool app, right? You get excited about, but unlike a cool app that you use and just forget, now you're actually stuck with value that you've lost versus, say, just time spent on something like TikTok, as it loses value or loses relevancy in your lives.
Yeah, I actually don't love the religious analogy, and it's funny because I am using religious overtones in the article. I think that's because we don't have good words for what's going on, so we default to the nearest thing. But I think the reason people call Bitcoin religious is because it's a very opinionated and idealistic mass movement, and um, we don't almost don't have secular mass movements like that anymore. Not in I don't know, not since like the progressive era in the 20s or something. Um, and so the closest analog is like, oh yeah, it's like a religious action. Um, but I think it's like fine to bite the bullet and say like we're motivated by um, our desire to instill certain values in a monetary system, and of course it takes a lot of conviction and action to bring that and make it a reality. So it kind of cosmetically resembles religion, but we're not making any metaphysical claims about salvation, although uh, sometimes the language strays into that territory. Um, but yeah, I sometimes think the religious analogy is a little bit of a cheap one, albeit probably the easiest one as well.
Well, I did a few episodes ago. I interviewed a guy named John Vervaeke, who is a works with cognitive science and psychology, and kind of focuses on well, anyways, he's put forward this idea about that we currently, especially in the West, live in kind of a meaning crisis, right? Where the traditional institutions have, like, 50, 100 years ago, majority of people belonged to some sort of institutional religion. They had, the Elks clubs, they had the Rotary clubs, they had, PTA meetings, whatever. There's a very centralized institutions that you used to kind of form community, that you use to get meaning in your life, whatever that may be, whether it's, working to raise money to, I think the Rotary Club does a lot of stuff with getting, glasses and stuff like that for people that have issues with sight in the third world. Anyways, like that's where you find your meaning in a lot of these things. And also families too. A lot of people are choosing to not have any kids or as few kids or whatever. And there's kind of that family unit involved where I think where the religious concepts are falling. And his idea is he practices Buddhism, but not in a religious way, but as a secular way of using. He calls them um, psychotechnologies, right? Meditation, ritualistic practices help to kind of bind people and kind of center them, I guess, in a way. And his idea where he thinks this is going to go is these kind of secular, using the psychotechnologies from these old institutions that we use and kind of using them more in a secular way, kind of like the mindfulness movement and meditation. And where I think that Bitcoin actually does fit quite well into that is that movements like this do give people a lot of meaning. There's also, I mean, we can see the ritual practices that we have, right? Running your own full node. There, there's the holidays that we already have, that we practice every year, and the kind
The
of,
holidays, yeah.
yeah, we have the Bitcoin Pizza Day. It's probably the biggest one, which is funny. And then we have the other days of like Hal's first tweet about it, and the release of the white paper or whatever, that we all kind of send out the obligatory tweets and stuff talking about it. But there's also the I find that when I look at it through a religious sense, it makes a lot more sense to me on how Bitcoin has grown, and the kind of things that we see coming. And just like, even with just like a full node, you look at it as where you are verifying kind of an objective truth in a way, and you're able to actually have that at your right at your hands. Like you can touch it, I guess, in a way, touch your laptop or whatever you're running your node on, and where it's very hard when you gotta look in other places around the world or in your life to kind of verify that the food that you have in your fridge, right? It says it's organic, but unless you're actually going to that farm and you're watching them and everything like that, is it really organic? Is it, you're trusting someone that it's verifiable, and that what you're consuming is what you thought you're consuming. Whereas with Bitcoin, that I think it's a very powerful kind of meme, and that you have right at your hands there, you're able to have a piece of your life where you are able to verify an objective truth by running your own full node. And the kind of, it may be kind of a holdover, that we use the religious terms in it, but I think that is very much ingrained into the human experience, and I see a lot of simpatico in Bitcoin with that.
Yeah, I like that point you make about an objective truth. Those are certainly few and far between these days, especially as our treasured truth giving institutions have completely become corrupt and unreliable, with the press being the main one. Uh, and through the lens of Bitcoin, it's all that much more clear just how much they failed in their mandate, in the last decade, because they are unable to report accurately on Bitcoin. And it's like this amazing red pill. All these people that understand Bitcoin deeply, look at how the mainstream media reports on it, and they realize that these journalists are, just kind of worthless as truth givers, and that editorial biases creep into every segment of coverage, including the coverage which is ostensibly news and independent. Uh, and the funny thing is that by far the most critical and important thing about Bitcoin to me is like the auditability, whereby any individual very very cheaply can run a full node and verify not just that their inbound payment is legitimate and valid and not counterfeited or anything, but also that every payment is valid, and by extension that every unit of every unit in the system is valid and was created in the agreed upon way. And compare that to, obviously, like fiat currency. There's no mechanical way to do that. Even the government could not audit all the currency in circulation. uh, most $100 bills are held outside the US. So like, who knows what it's being used for? The money supply is this like nebulous concept that like the Federal Reserve barely has a handle on. And then you compare it to gold, and it's like, well, you can probably audit an inbound gold payment that you're receiving. But even that, actually authenticating gold is like very costly, and then gold ends up settling into these supply chains where every link in the chain is authenticated, because precisely because it is so difficult to authenticate it. And then crypto Bitcoin developers are like absolutely dogmatic about making IBD as low effort as possible. So making the auditing of the chain possible for on a Raspberry Pi, for instance, and then almost every other Bitcoin killer or blockchain 2.0, 3.0, whatever, immediately surrendered that. they they're like, yeah, let's trade off against the verification, and let's buy some like better technical characteristics. And it like boggles my mind that the most radical, amazing feature of cryptocurrency, the ability to audit the whole supply and ensure that it's valid and has integrity, was immediately traded off by all of the competitors. And it's not just like, oh yeah, running an Ethereum full node is hard. Through Coin Metrics, we run full nodes for every chain, at top 50 or so in triplicate at a minimum. There are some, that shall remain unnamed, that we have spent literal months trying to get synced up, and we're talking enterprise hardware, really hardcore, um, DevOps guys, and we can't get it to run. So auditing the thing is literally, in some cases, impossible. And it's amazing. It's like the most precious feature of these kinds of systems, and the creators of all the alternative coins surrendered that like almost right away.
Well, yeah, and there's also a gentleman on Twitter that has been documenting his own journey and headaches trying to run one of those, probably the same unnamed chain, trying to actually run a full node on it. With I kind of stopped following it after a while because it just seemed like it was constant issues, and trying to actually get that to sync up.
I think
And
he actually finally synced it,
oh,
and
did
so
he?
like
Okay.
yeah, Ethereum's not lost yet, but the ratio of so you definitely need an SSD to sync an Ethereum full node, and the ratio of like days to sync versus days of progress you get from 1 day's worth of sync is like 1 to 8, which is like catastrophically bad in my opinion. So like that means that if you have performant hardware and you spend 24 hours syncing the chain, that will only get you 8 days worth of validated blocks. So that's completely unsustainable in my opinion. But yeah, the coin actually that I was referring to was EOS. Like running a full archive
Oh
node,
gosh.
the equivalent of a full archive node on EOS is until recently, until like a patch came out from Block One, it was almost literally impossible. And my if I had to guess, I would say like fewer than a dozen entities worldwide were doing that. And it has a bunch of like EOS has a bunch of different transaction types, and you don't get them from running the equivalent of a light client. You can't audit the like more exotic transaction types, so you have to run the full archive node to get the full picture of what's going on. And so we had a period of time where probably half a dozen entities in the world were actually able to fully verify the integrity of the chain.
Which is actually, there was BSV. I remember just seeing a thing on them where Ryan Charles with Money Button, where they actually were just saying that they were no longer going to be able to. It was no longer economically viable for them to run their own node. Um, so they were basically just going to be, once it gets to that point where quote unquote large players aren't able to do that, you're pretty much just trusting, whoever. I mean, there's really only a couple people within that chain that you're going to be trusting, um, to that, which it seems dangerously centralizing to where you have a point where you have a couple people that have a majority hash, and everyone is just following them and trusting that they are actually sending out true signals is exceedingly dangerous, um, to me, and I think to,
Yeah.
to most people, the idea of just going, okay, well, we're just going to trust that that they are mining genuinely, and everything that they're sending out is true. Where you get to be tens of thousands of dollars just to run a node, um, is just not doable, and especially when it's one of the larger players on that actual chain.
Yeah, I think of BSV like as actually is a very welcome service, despite all the scammery and so on. And it's welcome in the sense that they are empirically proving things that we knew to be true, but had no empirical evidence of. So, like from the period 2013 to 2018, um, uh, more technically minded folks would say big blocks are will actually destabilize your chain, and you won't be able to come to convergence easily, and they'll benefit large miners, and they'll make verification very costly. And then that was never borne out on Bitcoin because we prudently kept the blocks pretty small. And then BSV went ahead and like did the like reducto ad absurdum where they actually went ahead and ran all these like completely wacky experiments and like showed for once and for all that like the small blockers were right. Like yeah, like a 200 megabyte block is going to maybe cause a partition in the network because some clients are just going to ignore it, and others will try and verify it. And you're going to end up with tons and tons of stale blocks and orphans, and basically the convergence is not going to be guaranteed anymore. In a kind of a scientific sense, it's interesting that we have this like horrible experiment so that we can know for good that we were basically right.
Yeah, I don't understand why you're going to spend thousands of dollars a month to basically validate mostly weather data, which I think,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
and but I got into an argument with them about that, and they came up with, "Well, don't you think that in the light of the lies about climate change, that having verified on-chain weather data is a good thing?" And I was like, well, you're still trusting whoever's providing you that data to spit out,
That's actually
unless you're
amazing. So they looped like climate denialism into into their argument for like unbounded state growth.
yeah, I guess so. It,
That's
it's it's
hilarious.
it is really interesting because when you look at that chain, they have they've taken the position though too, which is totally anathema to Bitcoin, in that they're embracing regulation, embracing, if a judge issues an order to a miner, that miner should have to follow it and do whatever, right? It seems to me then there's no point in just have a centralized then a state currency then, or whatever. There's no point in having the amount of energy expenditure to secure the network if a centralized authority outside of that community can just tell them what to do, and then they're just gonna hop just jump to it and abide by every request. I mean,
Yeah,
they talk
and
about they talk about within Bitcoin, the developers, the conspiracy of the developers, and that's where the centralization is in Bitcoin, and they're giving the miners the power, right? But how is if let's just say they were right, how is giving the control of the network over to any world government that wants to issue a court order any better?
yeah, there's a kind of a startling lack of introspection, um, because like of course there exist potential centralization points in Bitcoin, but the community has always sought to mitigate those really aggressively, and has been pretty lucid about their existence. Which is like plenty of Bitcoiners weren't happy that Blockstream was the dominant kind of like political center in Bitcoin for a long time. What's funny is that they are absolutely their influence is much smaller, just by virtue of the fact that most of the core developers do not work for Blockstream now. They're split apart. The ones that are have subsidies are split between Chain Code, the DCI, Square Crypto now as well, and a handful of other um, firms that employ core devs. So even on that axis, Bitcoin is incredibly well distributed. Like, Blockstream absolutely does not have unilateral control. And like, more to the point, there haven't been any like hard or soft forks in Bitcoin in like 18 months now, right? So even if there was like absolutely centralized political power from some entity in Bitcoin, clearly they have not been able to force through, their nefarious schemes because it's so nicely poised. So yeah, it's funny. Like Bitcoin's warts are so visible, and it's like opponents will always have, um, very easy ability to criticize because Bitcoiners are so introspective and critical. But like if you evaluate any of their projects by that same standard, they are horrifically bad. But of course, that's never the way that it's presented.
You to jump into another topic, was that you wrote that the supply cap is critical to Bitcoin, and kind of just I think you're talking about it in ontological terms, but in other interviews, I'd listened to one a few weeks back, and I can't remember exactly. I apologize, but you stated that you'd also be fine with kind of if a small inflation had been built in. But I was just wondering if you could clarify kind of your position on the supply cap, and also what are your thoughts on like Peter Todd has proposed maybe kind of this indefinite inflation to continue the miner reward, to kind of solve this reward incentive continued network security. And it's something that I've been, I think one of the good things about Bitcoin is that a lot of the problems that aren't problems yet, but will be problems later, is that people are talking about these things and discussing them really early on, and versus kind of behind closed doors, and the users aren't really aware of them. So I think that's a really good aspect of Bitcoin. But what do you see as a possible solution as well to this problem of miner incentives in the future?
Well, first of all, it's not even clear that it is a problem. Um, we don't know yet, really, um, because we've never had the chance to observe what it would be like when the minor revenue is mostly fee based as opposed to subsidy based. My intuition, having thought about it a lot, is that we'll probably be okay, assuming Bitcoin block space continues to be highly valued, sort of highly coveted, and I think some of the fee sniping issues that were presented in a couple of papers, like the Narayanan paper, can probably be technically mitigated if they're not already. So my best guess is that it's actually not really a problem, and that right now we're probably overpaying for security because of the subsidy. Um, Although there remains work to be done to codify the kind of strength of settlement assurances on Bitcoin, for sure. And like if in 10 years, when the subsidy is much less and fees account for a greater fraction of miner revenue, if there is no usage on Bitcoin and the fees are really low, then Bitcoin will have failed anyway. Um, and if Bitcoin is very successful, I think there'll be no trouble getting fees. And like one way to think about this is like, imagine Bitcoin was a payments processing startup, and um, like a wholly centralized startup. That startup would have charged $1 billion just about for payments processing, and it's only 10 years old. Because Bitcoin itself has charged users $1 billion in dollar terms um, for transactions over the last decade. So by any yardstick, I think it's a very successful, payments processing system, and block space is highly coveted, even if we're in a bit of a lull right now. But I definitely think that the the chain that ends up predominating is going to have a lot of usage anyway, just by virtue of its dominant position. So that's my answer to that. But to your more critical question, like how critical is a supply cap in Bitcoin? Um, in the article I said it's ontologically essential. I think I don't remember the exact phrasing, um, but I was trying to push back at these folks that say, well, Bitcoiners are just going to change the cap. Um, and I think the model that I laid out at the beginning of the podcast, whereby we disentangle Bitcoin into a protocol for conveying value and into a fair property rights system, is very important there. So there's nothing about the protocol that requires like a protocol for moving money around on the internet that requires that the units of money are capped. That is, but that, however, was part of the specification of the property system to make sure it was fair and there was no unpredictable inflation. And so, given that Satoshi included it in the specification, I think it is critical. Um, it, you know, and like probably it's so critical that if the system changed, we had a quote unquote revolution and we like deposed all the full nodes or whatever and the devs, and we imposed a bunch of new inflation. I don't really think it would have continuity. I don't think it would be the same system anymore. It'd be something new. It would be like Bitcoin Prime or whatever. So I consider that cap to be one of the like core values, the same way that like the USA is founded on the core values of like strong individual rights, like the right to free speech, association, freedom of the press, the right not to have soldiers quartered in your home unilaterally, the strong states' rights relative to the central government, and then I would say the even though we haven't clearly codified what those essential founding values are, very unequivocally the the supply cap is one of those values. Although we certainly need to do some more work to actually describe what the rest of them are. I mean, people clearly believe that Bitcoin stands for a set of things, um, but we haven't necessarily written them out yet. It's like more like the English Constitution, where it's like a patchwork of like documents, like that you have to like assemble together to find a coherent whole. But yeah, the most unequivocal kind of foundational value of the property system, set up by Satoshi, is that supply cap. So yeah, I think it's sort of inherent to the system.
Yeah, and I think that there's been other proposals where it's like a short-term solution of of basically coins that haven't moved, say within a specified time, could be considered, like the lost coins, and that those could be recaptured, and put back into basically the pool for to extend the miner reward, which I don't agree with at all. I think that just destroys. I think any of these changes that we're, like changing the supply cap or introducing inflation, um, and especially the taking of old coins, I think just kind of it's a very much like a DAO sort of change
Yeah.
where it changes the what Bitcoin is, and it changes the mindset of trust that you have in that system of, well, if we can do this, because I think that was what obviously the reason, and you talked about that before, was the reason Ethereum leadership had to do that was because they knew once they moved to a proof of stake model, you don't want somebody out there that was a black hat who stole these coins, now has a massive pull on the system,
Yeah.
and massive say in what happens. So it's understandable why they did that, I guess, if you look at it from their point of view. But I think if Bitcoin goes down that route of kind of changing these very kind of first principles that we have, I think it's very I think it's very dangerous. I think it's a critical, attack vector on it. But then you have to weigh the trade-offs of, if as you said, this may not even be an actual issue. So, but if it does end up being an issue, then we have to rate, weigh the trade-offs. But it just kind of, it's almost physically bothersome to think about doing this to Bitcoin, where you just kind of like, revile and kind of pull back and just kind of give a disgusting kind of look on your face, I guess. Um,
Yeah, and
I
I
also,
was like,
oh,
I was
sorry.
guilty myself of musing about this recycling of old coins. But if you think about it in terms of like, what is the system set up with by Satoshi, about creating very strong property rights and assurances? What does that look like? It's one where your rights are absolutely sacrosanct. If you own the private key corresponding to a public key for an output, that's yours to transact with without interference. And if you look at the DAO reversal, that right was infringed upon. You know, maybe it was for like a good reason, quote unquote, but it was infringed on. And the only other time that you could conceivably say that's happened in Bitcoin was when there was this deliberate coordination to reorg out an inflation bug, which created like 80 billion coins or whatever. But the DAO hack was so notable because it was such a deeply political, uh, you know, tampering with the property assurances, and the beneficiaries were the same people that were coordinating the alteration to the ledger, to the list of who owned what. And that is the most like profound and obvious instance of like political discretion we've ever seen in a cryptocurrency, in my opinion. I mean, it's the most flagrant one. But yeah, like creating a coin recycling protocol would also, it would be a form of confiscation, and it would be impairing the property rights which people thought they had. So I was like musing about it like half in jest, like not entirely that seriously, and people like really responded with like a lot of invective, like really strong resistance. And like looking back on it, I realize now why they did, and I also realized that it was it's a complete non-starter because you want the rights to be like extremely strong.
No, and I think, well, like I said, I think it's important that we do, kind of muse about things like this because to just to dismiss them out of hand without actually, talking about them and um, because things have a tendency to recycle in Bitcoin, arguments and solutions and things like that, and have a tendency to come back. And I think it's really important to talk about them because once you do, you can kind of go back and like, well, we've had these conversations in the past, and this is why, right? So that when someone in 5-10 years is bringing this topic up again, we can kind of fall back on the previously established kind of, I guess, the research and the thought processes that brought us to that. And the last question I wanted to ask you, uh, with your article being, a peaceful revolution, there's um I can't I believe it was Murad had mentioned in an interview about how gold kind of basically requires kind of this fire and brimstone end of the financial system to be brought back. Whereas in his opinion was that Bitcoin doesn't need that. So, in your opinion, does Bitcoin need an apocalypse like gold to succeed, or can it, kind of like a mycorrhizal network spread across the system and kind of peacefully replace it before, some sort of apocalyptic ending to the current financial system ensues?
Yeah, I think one of the big myths about Bitcoin is that we have this apocalyptic nature to us. I mean, many Bitcoiners are like preppers as well because they just happen to be very skeptical about the financial system, which with good reason, in my opinion. But for sure, they're outside the mainstream on some of this stuff, and that gets conflated with Bitcoin itself, like as requiring somehow these apocalyptic end times, and it makes us look like the cultists who are like waiting for the Haley Bopp comet, and waiting for the rapture, and then we'll be the ones that are selected on the day of the rapture, right? Um, but I don't think that's the case. Like Bitcoin is gonna, if we're right, it's just gonna keep growing and seeing more and more usage and credibility, really regardless of the financial conditions, because there's always people on earth that are discriminated against and whose monetary system doesn't work for them. Like maybe it's not in the US, but there's always people that are victims of inflation and the wealth confiscating effects. And it just so happens that we're living at a time when things are super, super volatile, and the it looks like we might be entering like the end of the U.S. as like the unipolar hyperpower, um, under whose aegis the monetary system had functioned peacefully for 70 years. It looks like that time's coming to an end. So you could be forgiven for thinking that we're going to enter a period of chaos. But that is not a requirement for Bitcoin to be successful. It just so happens that Bitcoin's growth is occurring at a time when the monetary and financial system is starting to degrade, and people are it's being used as a political weapon more and more. Like Swift is like clearly being used for policy objectives by the US. China and Russia want to replace the dollar as the unit of international trade, and like even outside the dollar, like there's more and more like inflation events occurring because the gold standard is like completely obsolete, and so there's no way to keep states in check, and so you have all these states uh, that enter these like horrible death spirals, which just like obliterate the savings of everybody living there. But I don't think that's like an essential requirement for being like a Bitcoiner.
Yeah, no, I think that I always find it really, people in the West that when you talk to kind of the no coiner, the person that's only seen Bitcoin mentioned a couple times, and maybe they know their nephew had bought some and talked about it at one point, but where a lot of them just don't understand the importance of a sound financial network, just because we have enjoyed a very prosperous time, and they have never experienced a time in their lives. Some probably some very like grandparents that are approaching their 80s or 90s would remember back in a time as a child when that actually was. But those people are vastly disappearing. Most of us have never experienced that. Every time you go to the bank, as long as you got money in your account, you can pull it out, no problem. Your credit cards go through every time. It's not a big deal. But when you actually talk to people, or go into outside of the American tourism bubble, I guess, kind of go out to these places that are have true poverty and have, it's very weird as Americans to think how unstable the rest of the world is. I mean, you look at like in Thailand. I mean, they just recently had a military coup. I mean, somewhat recently. The idea of having something like that, and or your banks don't work, you can't pull out your money, or you're limited, like in Cyprus, to a few $100s per day. It's just something that's totally alien to us, and we don't really appreciate how weak of a foundation our kind of normalcy is built on. And yeah, I agree. I don't think Bitcoin needs it. I think that Bitcoin is very very synchronous with in history, where like all the technology was there 20 years ago really to build this, for the most part. Not, I mean, not completely, but
Yeah.
the majority of it was. And it was just a very synchronous period of history where Satoshi was working on and releasing this thing right as the last kind of meltdown was occurring, and people kind of really got woke up, not woke per se, but woke up and got red pilled to how fragile this system is.
Yeah, it really is amazing that Bitcoin's first decade has also been the decade in which central banks misbehaved the most, probably in the history of human civilization. I mean, the timing couldn't be more apt. It really boggles the mind, actually. Like there's been more money printing in the last decade than there's been ever, like as a function of like the fraction of money supply. And like when monetary economists say we're in an unprecedented territory and they like truly do not know what's going to happen, that's the time to freaking panic. It's like, wait, even the like PhD, Harvard, MIT experts have absolutely no clue what's going to happen. The Fed is just playing it by ear. The outcomes are likely not good. We don't know what they're going to be, but you could be forgiven for wanting to exit that system entirely and safeguard your wealth in something else, where you truly do understand the rules of the game. The contrast could not be greater between, uh, you know, trying to understand the the nature of a dollar in a bank account and its relationship to the money supply versus a Satoshi in your Bitcoin account and its relationship to the money supply. Like when you think about folks that hate Bitcoin and love the nature of the current system, it makes me think of like Roman citizens just before the fall. They're like, yeah, we don't need spears or weapons or anything. Rome, Pax Romanica is going to persist for another 1,000 years, and our civil society is going to exist just fine, and we're going to be great. It's like this world is cyclical, and we're periodically plunged into chaos. It seems to me that we're in a particularly chaotic period, which actually hasn't even begun to show its true nature. So, yeah, like we seem like the outliers and the fringe right now, but I really doubt in 10 years we're going to look back on this time and be like, oh, yeah, those Bitcoiners, were just a little too paranoid. Everything worked out great.
And it's funny too, because you see Bitcoin emerge out of like this last round, and then just the insaneness of the central banks and the amount of money that's been created. And I think a lot of those people that kind of the Keynesians really understand that this is, like you said, uncharted territory, and recognize that this is a problem. And then what they've done is in 100% 180 contrast to Bitcoin is, well, what's this invent? A new monetary theory, which says that this is actually fine. Don't worry about it. And in
Yeah,
fact,
don't you
you
love
can
that?
just do, yeah, MMT is just, it's amazing. Where it's like,
Literally
where,
changing a theory to suit the facts.
yeah,
That's
well,
always a kind of a sound epistemic practice.
well, it just kind of reminds me of like those doomsday cults where they come down and then they go, oh well, actually it's not going to end now. We actually realized that our our readings were a little bit off, and actually we don't need to worry about it. We can just push it off. And when you have actually Paul Krugman starting to criticize, maybe this the idea of printing this much money is a little bit crazy. I think you really need to give pause when he's actually sounds sane on the subject of monetary theory.
And I think the reason why the Keynesians, so to speak, feel so empowered is because the doomsday prophecies of the gold bugs did not come true in 2010 when it was discussed like doing a bunch of QE. That's when gold buggery became extremely popular, and the idea was that we would have inflation or hyperinflation in the US, and then we didn't have that. And then um, there was a lot of like victory dances from the Keynesians to like, see, look, everything worked out great, we didn't have inflation. And they didn't realize that what actually happened was the velocity of money dropped because the QE did not have the desired effect of like stimulating the economy meaningfully. It just ended up parked in financial assets. But that's a little bit more obscure. Like it's more difficult to reason about that, because the impulse and then the outcome were not clearly visible. Like it wasn't that evident that creating the money supply created all these distortions and like financialized the world and led to this like obscene inflation in financial assets and real estate and equities and bonds. So it's a little bit tougher to put together the cause and the effect, and it's not even that obvious what the negative effects of that QE are, although you certainly feel it. Like you can just feel that there's been this increase in income inequality and wealth inequality, especially if you are a millennial and you're renting your first apartment and you realize that you're not going to be able to buy a home on your salary until you're 40 or whatever. So you can feel the Cantillon effect, but it's a little bit harder to put your finger on it as opposed to saying, yeah, like the dollar has really directly depreciated by this amount.
Well, I'd like to thank you so much for taking time out of your Saturday to come on. And how could people see what you're up to and get a hold of you?
Follow me on Twitter. It's Nic, NIC __ Carter. Someone was squatting the Nic _ Carter account, I guess. I have a bone to pick with that guy. That's really the main way. And you can find me on Medium as well. I write a lot. I think it's also, yeah, I'm not sure how you find people on Medium, but I should be findable.
Well, I'll have links to your Twitter profile as well as your to the Medium article that we were talking about in the show notes. So if you just go and you click on that article, you'll be able to go up to the top and click follow and be able to follow everything that Nic writes. Just go to didyouknowcrypto.com/EP51. That's EP51 for episode 51. And once again, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, man. Absolute pleasure.